Welcome everyone. I'm Mike Price. I'm a geologist. I live here in Birch Bay and truly enjoy the community. And one of my favorite projects is to come down to the bay and kayak and play in the mud and just enjoy the people and the scenery. So today what I'm going to do though is I'm going to walk with you up to the north along the Birch Bay Berm, which is a recently constructed feature designed to protect our community from high tides, from inundation, from wave action, and from high water. So we're standing right now at the mouth of Terrell Creek. Now Terrell Creek drains a fairly small area, but it extends clear down to an area west of Ferndale along the refineries at Cherry Point, and Terrell Creek actually enters the saltwater right here. This is a very interesting little drainage because it responds to high tide or tidal influx, and the water will rise on the tide and it will actually push up the drainage, and we'll have actual upstream flow clear up almost to the park on some high tide events. Now Terrell Creek's quite interesting because it dumps a whole bunch of water into Birch Bay, and when we have one of these tidal events like what we call king tides, where the combination of a low pressure system, onshore winds, and a very high tide, typically after a new moon, sometimes a full moon, cause the water to back up in Terrell Creek and push way upstream. So north of here, the county has been working to develop, to maintain a structure called a berm. And this berm is designed to prevent seawater from the bay from encroaching or coming in, flowing over the beach and onto the roads and into people's yards. So we're going to walk up the berm and I'm going to talk a little bit about it. And I'll be working from some notes, so you'll see me flipping papers around. But in any case, we're standing right at the mouth of Terrell Creek on the north side on Birch Bay. So we're going to walk a little bit over onto the grass here, and you can look into Terrell Creek and see water flowing in or out. We're going to find out in a minute because we're almost at high tide right now. And sure enough, it is flowing out right now, and there's a good amount of storm drainage coming down Terrell Creek because the last few days have been off and on rainstorms. So we might be right past high tide today. It was about an 8.5 foot tide a little after 1 o'clock, so the tide is pushing back, flowing or ebbing back out, and Terrell Creek is flowing to the sea again. Now if you notice, there's an awful lot of logs piled along here. Those logs are captured when Terrell Creek does its fluctuation in and out, and sometimes these logs float way up toward the park and then they float way back down when the tide goes back out. So keep an eye on these logs because they'll tell us quite a bit about what's going on with our processes here on the coast. Now if you notice here on the ground, you'll see a whole bunch of debris stacked up with some rock behind it that looks pretty clear. Now on a typical high tide event, that debris will mark the high tide point of a monthly cycle. And so the last normal high tide we had here was probably right about, with the storm, right up to here. It was, I'll give you an idea. Look at the logs and you'll know where the last storm event occurred. If you turn around and look back to the east toward Birch Bay Drive, you can see there's our berm. This is a brand new feature. This piece was actually started in December 2019, January 2020, with some initial grade work where a company that we'll meet later called Granite Construction brought in many tons of fill material and placed that to create a barrier, an obstruction, so that seawater will not cross over the berm and go onto Birch Bay Drive. We'll look at some features on the other side of the berm soon that are designed to capture any water that does cross and take it back to the sea. So with that, let's start walking up the beach. Just kind of keep an eye on the logs along the shore, this little grassy slope here, which is pretty well protected, and the berm, which is designed to protect the community of Birch Bay. This berm it will eventually extend for about 1.5 miles from this point here all the way up to a street called Cottonwood, which is up north of where Harborview Drive comes down to hit the bay. So why are we having to build a berm? It turns out that 10,000 years ago, after the last major Canadian or Cordilleran ice melted out, means it came from Canada, piled up here about 7,000 to 8,000 feet thick, if you can imagine that. And then it just melted over time. But by 10,000 years ago, it was melted out. People were living here. The native population was pretty well established along the bay. The bay was pretty much in its modern shape and design. But then, in the early 1950s, the Army Corps of Engineers came in here, and they took away a whole bunch of gravel. They took, if you can imagine this, a yard of gravel is a 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot cube. The Corps removed for construction over at a radar facility a mile or more east of here. They removed between 200,000 and 300,000 cubic yards of material. So, after that, the bay started to behave a little differently. We started having these flood events and damaging storms. So, and there was a very unusual erosional cycle that developed in here where material was being transported along the shore like it normally wouldn't be. So the designers and planners put in these little concrete barricades pointing straight out into the water called groins. And these groins were supposed to capture sediment and allow sedimentation to occur on the probably the down current side of the groin. Trouble is, it didn't really work. And in addition to that, a lot of water is flowing into the bay from the land. In fact, behind us is one of the big floodgates where we have a creek that flows into Terrell Creek. And with the high tide, if you don't keep water out of the drainage system, water is pushed way toward land in pipe down here to where you actually have salt water coming in and inundating land features. This one is mostly underground. There's a second one that we'll see up north that is above ground that had to be completely rebuilt by Granite Construction to maintain a new flow regime with water coming from the land going into the bay here locally. So we're starting out at the beginning of the berm, the south end of the berm. And you'll see that there's logs scattered all over here. Some of those are natural, some of those were actually replaced by Granite when they finished this part of the project. In fact, they had a huge log yard stacked right here, a big stack yard to store all of those big logs that they would use as they went up the beach. So we're going to walk up the beach now and just kind of watch things as we go. You'll notice that along the berm it's capped with a crushed limestone. And this crushed limestone rock is especially designed to maintain its location, its position, even during the wave events. And it's been tested at least twice now since December, and in both cases it's held up quite well. Welcome to stop 2. We're about half away from the mouth of Terrell Creek to the Bay Breeze, the restaurant that's on the water side of the road. And we're standing on the berm at a point that's been temporarily placed or designed so that we can have a way to cross over the vegetation that's been planted on both sides of the berm. This vegetation that you see is something called dune wild rye. It's designed to live in fairly salty conditions and can sustain quite a bit of wave action. It's a rhizome, so it has very dense, thick roots. So wave action doesn't really affect it. It's been planted only in the last month, so it hasn't really started to green up yet. But you'll see it on both sides of the berm here. And we'll follow down a little ways and I'll start to show you how the berm actually behaves during a storm event. Now you'll notice here that logs are sort of scattered. There's some up here right against the crest of the berm. These may have been brought up here during the last storm on January 13th. Now remember to watch the large logs that we see that are right up against the crest of the berm. These were actually placed by the construction company, but they've been moved around a little bit by the last storm event. If you look down further out on the beach, maybe 30, 40 feet, you'll see a debris line that represents probably the last high tide of our most recent tide cycle, where normal wave action, not storm-driven waves, actually brought in a little more debris and placed it right there about probably 3 or 4 feet below where we're standing now. During the January 13th storm, waves actually crested over the berm, and you can see some of the debris that those waves actually placed on the berm. Water did cross the berm and did start to fill the retention ditch that you see here over on the next to the road. That ditch is used to capture water that goes over the berm, and then to allow that water to be gathered up and go back into those drains that you see that are capped with the iron cap, and go into pipes and back into the salt water. And they worked really well during the last storm event. This stretch of berm here was crossed by some wave action, but you notice that the walking surface is in good shape. Some of the plants had to be replaced, especially on the water side. You'll see these plants are a little bit, they look beat up in fact, but plants on the other side are looking better. So the berm is doing what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to catch water that would have normally gone clear across the road and into the condominium development to the east. It captured it and it pushed it back into the ocean, into the bay. Okay, we're between stops 2 and 3 right now. We're walking north toward the Bay Breeze restaurant. And at this point, we're going to transition from our limestone trail surface onto a concrete structure that was actually built here to help protect or tie into the Bay Breeze. And you can see that there's been a lot of cobble-sized or fist-sized rocks placed here, but it's slightly lower than the surface of the berm that we've been walking on. And during the January storm, water did come over the gravel rock that's placed and flow into this low area to our east toward the road. Again, it was captured by drains, several drains, and then went back into the salt water. So there was some inflow here, but not a lot. We're almost to stop 3, and we're a couple hundred feet north of the Bay Breezes, the restaurant on the water side. And if you look around us, you'll see we're still walking on a gravel path. It's a crushed limestone path. We still have our retention swale along the east side toward the road. We also have a yellow bucket there. That's Granite Construction left that. That's a spill cleanup kit. In case there's an emergency here and they have to do a beach cleanup, that's available to use to do what we call diking and damming and soaking up anything that we don't want. Now remember, Granite Construction's been working here for just over a year. They're about ready to finish the project or finish all the large construction parts of the project. And we're at stop 3 on the field trip. And we started this at stop 1, but now I've got some more information I'd like to throw in. So I'm going to tell you about the timeline for the berm project and for the whole area. Again, we go back 10,000 years before present. There was glacial ice that was up to, say, 6,000 to 7,000 feet thick, right here, covering us all up. And that ice melted out from about 12,000 before present till 10,000 before present. And native coastal Salish community moved in here, especially in the summer, for things like going clamming, going fishing, going crabbing, the same things we do today. So this place has been used as a recreational destination and a livelihood destination for 10,000 years. So if you're curious about the total project timeline, we're going to provide you a very detailed outline and a graphic to show you what's happened over the last 10,000 years. But mostly what's happened since the 1970s, when people really started to come here and we started to have these king tide storms, the storms that cause all the problems in the wintertime. You'll see some fencing here. This is temporary fencing to keep people from trampling our recent planting of a native grass called beach wild rye. We'll talk more about that later too. So you'll see beach wild rye planted often on both sides of our walking path as we go to the north. Now over on the east side of the path, you'll see one pedestrian access point. This is a non-ADA or disability access point. You'll see others that are completely ADA compliant as we go down the street. Notice these two brown humpy looking things. These are called beehives. They're actually an iron filter that allows water to flow into high-density polyethylene pipe, HDPE pipe, and run back out to the saltwater in the bay. These are located along what we call a retention swale. You'll see it on both sides of the berm in some places. Sometimes it'll be on the east side, sometimes it'll be on the west side of our travel. But you'll see the retention berm and these collection points. And we're going to continue now on down the beach, just walking on the trail and talking about things. Now here we see some other things that are happening lately that belong to the driftwood. That's a beach fire that's been abandoned. It's still burning. It'll probably burn until that stump's gone with the way the wind's blowing. One of the things we're going to have to do here is come up with some kind of a plan to manage beach fires. Because once this ryegrass comes up, it is a fire-tolerant species, but it's going to be really, really tough to keep it alive if it gets burned out every summer. So when you're here visiting, remember, take good care of our ryegrass. It's going to hold a lot of this surface on both sides of our walkway, both sides of the berm. It's going to maintain it. So we're going to walk on down now, and sure enough, right in front of us, we'll see that the walking path transitions from crushed limestone, which is a very good, easily maintained surface, to actual poured concrete. This concrete is a strip that's about several hundred feet long. It goes from the point we're at now, right by the Rain Tree Resort. It goes right down to the office for the Birch Bay Chamber of Commerce, and it's designed for all kinds of access for wheelchairs, kids on strollers. It's not designed for bicycles. It's not, or for motorized wheeled vehicles. This is strictly a pedestrian path. So a mom pushing a stroller is fine, but the kids on their mountain bikes, we wish they'd ride on the road. We're going to continue walking to the north on the concrete path. And as we are walking, keep an eye on both sides of the trail, and you'll see work that's still in progress. You'll see a temporary fence on the west side of the trail. That fence is designed to protect the retention swale, which is now crossed over to the west side of the walking path. It's to keep people, our visitors, from going in on the slope of the berm and disturbing the ryegrass, which is still trying to take root. On the east side of the trail, to our right as we walk north, you'll see that there's still some grade work, what we call flat work, that needs to be done. We've got to finish putting in the paving along this parking strip, and eventually, or soon, once the paving's done, when it warms up, the contractor will come in and put in the striping and some signage for more parking than we've had here before. That's one of the good benefits of this berm project. We've actually gained some parking. It's more organized parking too. People just don't have to park parallel on the side of the road anymore. Now we're approaching a power pole, and around that power pole the contractor has created a planting area, and they've just started to landscape this. You'll see that they've placed some brown bark mulch. They've placed a log. And here, although it's not very nice looking, this will become a receptacle for our pet waste. It's got to be buried in that planting strip. So we'll have pet waste canisters all up and down the beach. We will also have temporary, especially summertime, wheeled bins for your trash. So when you come here to visit, be sure and use the wheeled structures, the wheeled containers, because we've always been very, very careful to clean up trash on the beach. And sure enough, when there's hundreds of visitors here, we have to go out and dump those things several times in a week. So watch for those big green wheel bins in the summer. Okay, we're going to continue walking north to stop 4. And at stop 4, I'll show you one of the major drainage features that's been created or built by our contractor, and you'll get to see how we're actually moving fresh water from the land to the sea, because at this low tide we'll actually see the top of an outflow pipe that goes from what's called a floodgate into the saltwater. Welcome to stop 4. This is the next to last stop on our tour, and we're up on the berm now. We're just north of where we transitioned from the concrete path back to crushed limestone. We've actually gone up and gone around the temporary fence that's been placed to help protect the planting of our beach wild rye, and we're looking south back toward the bay breeze. You can use that as a point of reference to the south, and if you look to our east, there's our Chamber of Commerce building. Now, since we're down close to the beach, we're standing right about the mean high tide mark for a typical winter tide. And if you look south to the beach, along the beach, you can see that there's driftwood, big logs scattered clear up onto the berm. And if you remember when the January 13th storm occurred, the king tide event, driftwood was pushed right up onto the berm. A little bit of water crossed over the berm and it was captured in the retention ditches, returned back to the salt water. But the berm stood, it protected well, and most of the vegetation on this section of the berm survived quite well. So sure enough, driftwood is scattered all up and down the beach. You see the big logs up at that king tide event maximum line. You see a lot of debris down at our current high tide line. Again, high tides right now are typically in the 9.5 foot range. So this gives you an idea where high tide is on a typical winter day with no wind and no storm event. Also notice that we've got a lot of waterfowl that just started to come into the shore. For some reason, they just wanted to come visit us, I think. And I'm not sure really why they're doing that. We'll have to ask our birders. Now, if you notice too, out to the into the water, you see a large black linear or pipe structure. That's a drain. That drain actually flows from underneath the visitor center and directly into the salt water. It's a large diameter, high density polyethylene pipe that connects underground to a tidal gate. And that tidal gate, when it's functioning, is supposed to prevent salt water from going back up into a little creek that's right behind the visitor center and flowing clear up into the now inactive Sea Lakes Golf Course. But the way that tidal gate should work is it'll stop the tide from pushing salt water in, but when the tide goes out, it opens and allows excess water to flow back into the bay. So there's our discharge from our tidal gate. Driftwood scattered all over the beach, and there's waterfowl. Let's turn and look north, okay? Do you see any driftwood up high on the berm? You don't, do you? What's happened here is this construction happened generally after the January 13th storm. This final grading was performed then. All the logs were placed right at the high tide mark down here where we're standing. So you look to the north and we see a very clean slope on the berm. Look to the south and you see where the logs have scattered all along the berm during that January 13th storm. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that storm before we continue to our last stop. That storm was a classic Birch Bay king tide event. And a king tide occurs when you have a winter high tide, typically just after a full moon, especially just after a new moon. And that tide event, the high tide event, occurs at the same time that we have a low pressure system over the area and a onshore wind, what we call a tidal fetch. So what we had was a storm fetch pushing wave action onto the shore. We had a low pressure event occur, which actually allows the tide to raise an extra 6 inches, maybe a foot above its normal high tide mark. And you combine that with the high tide, very high tide, like 9.5 to 10 foot normal high tide, the extra high tide, the raise in the tide because of the low pressure, and then the storm surge or storm fetch that's pushing waves onto the shore. And that's actually what drove that king tide event. It was very similar to the last event we had here in December 2018 before the berm was built. And during that 2018 event, there was extensive damage, possibly $5 million worth of damage along Birch Bay Drive and into properties along the drive. In fact, in December 2018, one half of Birch Bay Drive was washed out completely, and it took 6 months to get that repaired and back to normal two-way traffic. That happened up north of Harborview, which is still about a half mile to the north of us. Now, just last month, we had another very similar storm event. That was, the waves were of similar size, the tide was just about as high as before, but the berm protected everything to the east of us, to the shore side. And the berm performed very, very well. There was a little bit of debris and slosh onto Birch Bay Drive, and it was quickly cleaned up, and we had traffic restored right away. The crushed limestone path performed very well. The plantings, the beach ryegrass, performed well here. Down south of the Bay Breeze, they had to replace a little bit of it, but that was expected. The retention swales and the return piping worked really well, and it only took a day or so for all the salt water to move right back into the bay. So the project is on schedule, and that the last storm really just performed a test on the berm without really slowing things down for more than a day or so. So now we're going to cross back over, go back around the fence, and continue north on the berm up to the area of the proposed Birch Bay Library, and we'll take one more stop there, and we'll talk about the berm and just review why it was built, how it was built, and just tell you a little more about all the activities on the berm. So we're going to walk north now for about another 200 yards maybe, and start again. Welcome back. We're now at stop 5, the final stop of our tour. We're almost up to the location of the proposed Birch Bay Library, the community library. It'll be in that rock-faced home just through those big poplar trees. And we're starting to see down ahead to the north construction. That's the Granite crew down there finishing out some of their grade work up by Harbor View Road, and they're going to be here for probably another month or so doing grade work, and then they'll be doing their finish work, their flat work, all the way up and down the berm. So here what I want to do is just review the project for you a little bit so you know what's been happening. Remember when the Army Corps of Engineers came here in the early 1950s, they pulled out at least 300,000 tons of material from the bay. Since December of 2019 or January 2020, Granite has replaced approximately 210,000 tons of material. So we took a lot out, we put almost all of it back. And the Granite has actually sloped and recontoured the entire surface. This slope is designed to break up the energy of the waves as they come onto shore during a storm event. And this goes back to the Wolf Bauer study that was done in the 70s and his original design. And in this presentation you'll see cross sections and design work that shows how the surface has been resloped, reshaped to help break up those waves, and the berm has been raised to a high enough elevation to capture typical storm energy and push it right back to the sea. So here we are standing at the north end of the berm. This project was intended to be completed in 300 days. Turns out that we're only into about 210 days of the project. So in an actual day, a project workday timeline, we're ahead of schedule. They're doing really, really well. Again, the project uses natural slope to break up the wave energy and protect the beach. And we've got to say that no engineering can prevent perfect damage control along this road, along the berm. There is a chance that storms will come in and cross the berm. There are chances of the berm being breached, but especially around the edges of where the construction's been done, we are seeing that there are some events that cause driftwood and debris to be carried onto the road. And we do look forward to you all coming back to visit the bay and really, really appreciate the berm. So for ongoing activities, you can see that they're just finishing out construction in the north up by Harbor View. Birch Bay Watershed Management is also doing a drainage project on beyond Harbor View, clear up to almost Cedar Street. So we're going to have some construction here through the summer of 2021, and we should be able to use the berm in its best form by early to midsummer. So with that, I'd like to thank you for coming along on our tour. I'd also like to thank some of our sponsors and contributors, including Whatcom County, several agencies, Public Works Department, their administration and their council, their emergency management group. They provided project planning, project support, funding, and in the case of the storms, emergency response all along the berm. I want to thank Granite Construction. They've been doing a spectacular job on the berm, and they've been staying in very close contact with our community so that we know where they're going to work, when, and generally they keep us out of their way and get the job done. We stay out of their way and then get the job done. I want to thank Wings Over Water for helping to put the concept together for this event, and if you come up here for the Wings event, definitely walk the berm and enjoy all the waterfowl and other birds, shorebirds and seabirds in our area. Also want to thank DLS Media, who's doing our production work, and especially the residents of Birch Bay for all your patience and persistence as we work through this project. And again, I'm Mike Price. I'm your tour guide. I just live right up on the hill, right over. In fact, I look right down on the park where the Granite Construction camp is. So it's it's a very, very special little place for me and for all of our residents. So thank you all for attending today, and we're going to go home and get warm.